Thank you for joining the Mathematical Discourse webinar. I'm Monisha Karnani, STEM Management Analyst of Mathematics at OSSI, the Office of the State Superintendent of Education here in DC. I've been a math teacher and have spent the past 10 years working as a teacher educator. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping suggestions. There is a question box on your screen. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to type those in, and we will get to them as soon as possible. Also, if there's any issues with the sound, feel free to enter those into the question box too, and we will work to rectify those. During interactive portions of this webinar, I may invite participants to verbally share their responses. If you'd like to volunteer, there is a small hand icon that indicates you raising your hand. So if you'd like to volunteer, you can use that function. You can also type your responses into the question box if you'd like to participate but not speak to the group. I will do my best during the webinar to answer questions as they arise, and if I can't address them all during the webinar, I will make sure to stay online for a few minutes at the end of the session or follow up with individuals via email. The recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides will be posted on the OSSI website within the next week. Tomorrow, you will receive a survey from OSSI to receive your PLUs for this session. You will have one PLU awarded for your participation in this session and the completion of the feedback survey. In order to receive those PLUs, you need to stay on the webinar for the duration of the time that we are together today. PLUs usually take about 10 days from the completion of your survey. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be talking about mathematical discourse. Start off by sharing a little bit about what it is and why it is important. To do that, I'm going to have us take a poll. I'm going to read through the poll questions before I put the poll up on the screen. Which of the following are examples of mathematical discourse? A student asks whether he should show her work on an assignment. B, a student writes in his journal to explain his mathematical reasoning. C, a student says, I notice a pattern that I think will always work. Each number is 3 more than the one before. D, the teacher provides a counterexample to a method posed by a student. And E, a group of students discuss the mathematical conditions in which an idea won't always work. So take a minute to review those. There are multiple answers, so think of which of these are examples of mathematical discourse. And I'm going to launch a poll for you to respond virtually. Take a minute to select your choices. Remember, you can select multiple responses.
Five more seconds to vote.
Take about 5 more seconds to put your votes in if you have not done so already. All right, let's take a look at what responses we got. The correct answers to this question were B, C, and E. I'm going to talk a little bit about why options A and D are incorrect. If we look at A, it says a student asks whether he or she should show her work on an assignment. This question is a clarifying question, mostly focused on the procedure, not necessarily talking about the content. So in order for something a student says to really be considered mathematical discourse, it's important that it's content specific. Looking at option D, where it says the teacher provides a counterexample to a method posed by a student, D is incorrect because the student is not actually talking in this. This is student, we are looking for student discourse in the classroom. This is when the teacher is doing the talking. When we look at mathematical discourse, our hope is really to get our students talking. So discourse is really the student talking about mathematical content. With that in mind, we'll look here at this definition. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to use this definition for mathematical discourse. So I'll give you a minute to read over the slide. Mathematical classroom discourse is about whole class discussions in which students talk about mathematics in such a way that they reveal their understanding of concepts. Students also learn to engage in mathematical reasoning and debate. Discourse involves asking strategic questions that elicit from students both how a problem was solved and why a particular method was chosen. Students learn to critique their own ideas and others' ideas and seek out efficient mathematical solutions. So digging into that a little bit deeper, we're going to look at this slide that talks a little bit about the features of mathematical discourse: structure, content, purpose, and product. So as we think about structures, traditional classrooms tend to have a teacher asking a question where students volunteer their answers. The teacher reacts by providing corrective feedback, ultimately approving whatever method it was that the students provided. In contrast, discourse is really multi-directional. It's responsive. Students carry the responsibility of participating, reacting, and evaluating the contributions of their peers. Student responses extend the instruction, with the teacher supporting the conversation rather than reducing or, in some cases, removing the cognitive load from the students. So this is really an opportunity for students to think and evaluate what their peers are saying. Content in a traditional classroom tends to be predictable. Conversations are polished, focus on getting students to arrive at answers that already exist either in the teacher's head or in the textbook. These conversations are often disjointed. They don't have connections between different tasks, and they're dictated by timelines often put on us by curriculum coverage or pacing guides. In contrast, discourse should help draw connections among ideas, enable students to distinguish between valid and invalid arguments. Students develop shared understandings and construct knowledge through dialogue. The teacher builds on student ideas to design curriculum rather than superimposing a predetermined structure upon the students. Purpose traditionally is to transform information and standardize student thinking. The teacher uses conversations to monitor progress and uses those conversations to really make decisions about when to move on to the next topic. Students listen, absorb, and trust that the teacher is giving them the correct or right information. This tends to be a very passive approach to a purpose. In contrast, when the purpose of discourse is to assist the teacher and students in learning more about the topic. Student conversation is focused on exploring and explaining ideas and connections. The discourse of the class seeks to engage students, promote inquiry, and establish new understandings. This is a more active approach to conversations in the classroom. Product, traditionally, is a dissemination of facts and efficient techniques. This form of knowledge sharing is not transformational since it may not lead to a change in the way students think. In contrast, students engage in discourse to construct, negotiate, and verify mathematical ideas. The teacher supports students to synthesize ideas through intentional interventions, ensuring students reach a shared understandings and a deeper analysis of the mathematics. Discourse in the classroom requires three things. It requires participation, which are opportunities in the dialogue for students to become engaged, question others, try out new ideas, and hear diverse points of view. It requires commitment, where students are open and willing to hear the position of their peers. And it requires reciprocity, a willingness for students to engage in an equilateral exchange with others. I'm sorry, I'm taking a second to review some of the questions that have come in. I'm going to read one of these out loud. It says, based on the definition, it seems that mathematical discourse takes place exclusively in a group discussion. Can you explain why journaling and student-centered explanations contributing to mathematical discourse? So we are going to talk a little bit as we go through this about different ways of having conversations in the webinar, later on in this webinar, but journaling and student-centered conversations might not necessarily be whole class, but they are effective forms of discourse. It's really more about the content of those courses, or of those discourses. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but wanted to make sure that I addressed it since it just popped up on my screen. All right, so there are a number of different types of mathematical discourse. We just talked about the components of discourse, and here you can see the different types of discourse. Take a minute to review some of these different categories. As you notice on this slide, there's an increase in complexity as we move down the table from answering to generalizing. Discourse can range from basic to intricate, and as a teacher, you have the opportunity to really push your students through these levels. We might even liken this progressive nature to, say, Bloom's taxonomy, where we go from remembering to understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. The same thing is kind of happening here in the complexity of the discourse. With that said, it's really important to remember that this is not the progression as we get older. And so students at the youngest grade level should be able to get into the predicting, justifying, and generalizing levels as well of discourse. On this slide, you have an opportunity to look at what meaningful mathematics discourse looks like in a classroom based on what students are doing and what teachers are doing. You'll notice that teachers are very intentionally engaging students in purposeful sharing. They're selecting and sequencing approaches and strategies for analysis and discussion in the classroom. They're facilitating discourse among students, asking very careful questions to ensure that students are really the ones engaging in the conversation and it's student-to-student interaction as opposed to teacher-to-student interaction. And as they're doing all of this, are ensuring that their students are making progress toward the mathematical goals of the curriculum and of the course. In a classroom with meaningful mathematical discourse, you might notice students presenting and explaining ideas. They might be working in pairs, in small groups, or even in whole group settings. They're listening carefully and really hearing what their peers are saying and able to engage in a back and forth dialogue with their peers. They're seeking to understand how their peers came up with the solutions that they came up with and identifying different approaches to solving a task. They might be discussing errors that they see, discussing additional ways to solve a problem, and they're really able to identify and point out connections between different approaches to problems. This is what you see in the students we often talk about is this productive struggle with appropriate scaffolds from the teacher for support. So the teacher is really taking time to figure out where are the students and what is the least amount of information I can give them to keep them going. And students are using a wide variety of approaches to convey their knowledge. And some of this, as it was asked earlier about journaling, students might be expressing these things through oral presentations just by raising their hand. They might have written explanations. graphical explanations, or draw pictures or other symbolic representations to really explain their understanding of the content. So I'm going to ask a question while this slide is up and ask you to respond via the question box. How might discourse look different in an elementary school versus a high school? So thinking about when we walk into, say, a third grade classroom, how do we expect the conversations to really look and feel differently than if we were to walk into, say, a 10th or 11th grade classroom? I'm curious to hear how you think those might look different. All right. So I see that there's a difference here that someone has said it might change, the content may change, but the discourse is discourse, and that's true. You might also see with our younger learners more pictures versus words in their explanations. I see somebody mention that you might have more structured dialogue for elementary students as you teach them how to have those conversations. Excuse me, those conversations. I think another person said that they will be different in the progression of complexity. Third grade classrooms might utilize more group or partner sharing as opposed to whole group discourse. That might be more prevalent in a high school classroom. And in a high school classroom, it's been pointed out that teachers can also ask students to create the questions that will drive the discourse. So there is a change in how the teacher interacts, maybe more heavily facilitated for the younger learners and less facilitated or student-led facilitation at the higher grades. Also a difference in how we're having the discourse. It's really important to think of this as we can do this, and I really like, I believe, the comment that said the content changes, but effective discourse can happen at all of these grade levels. And it's important for us to remember that we can achieve this discourse even with our youngest learners, and we should be expecting to do it at all age levels. So here's a classroom example of a conversation between a teacher and some students in a classroom. Take a moment to read this conversation about the denominator in a fraction. This probably looks like a classroom dialogue you've seen before. The strategies that the teacher uses, there's a number of strategies in here. She's using and she's defining math terms. So if you look at the first statement by the teacher, she mentions a denominator and then defines it right in the sentence saying this is the bottom number. She also used in her second statement this idea of thumbs up or thumbs down to really get a feel of the classroom. This is a way for students to quickly offer up something that she can then react to and get a pulse on the entire classroom. She asked students to explain their disagreements and even encourages students to rephrase what their peers are saying, encouraging the use of math words. I think it was when she said later on, she said, "Can you say that again using math words we've been learning?" So why is mathematical discourse important? Well, first of all, it builds mathematical fluency. Think about a foreign language. Even if you've taken lots of years of studying a foreign language, you understand the language, you can communicate in the language, but you might not be thinking and processing in that language. To create fluency, we really have to make this kind of a second nature, where in the way that an English speaker thinks in English or a Spanish speaker might think in Spanish, a mathematician should be also thinking in math, so building that fluency. It also establishes a student as an expert, building confidence. It removes the teacher from the role of the mighty answer holder and really puts that confidence and that curiosity back on the student and puts them in charge of their own learning. And then enabling students to demonstrate mastery allowing them to share ideas, and providing teachers an opportunity to push thinking and address gaps in understanding when they're identified in the classroom. So we're going to look now at 3 different strategies to encourage discourse. And if you can, I'm going to ask you to grab a scrap piece of paper if there's something sitting next to you. If you have, grab a scrap piece of paper if there's one sitting next to you, and if you have a calculator or want to use your cell phone, please feel free to bring that out again. So the 3 strategies that we're going to look at today are multiple paths to multiple solutions, and how do you ensure that tasks remain at this level. We're going to look at increasing student-to-student discourse and strategies to support students listening to one another, disagreeing with each other, and questioning each other. And then we will also look at questions or specific questions that support students to clarify and justify their idea, creating more meaningful discourse in the classroom. So we're going to try a task. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to find the mean, median, and mode of the set of numbers on your screen: 6, 5, 5, 5, 7, 9, and 11. If you could quickly find the mean, median, and mode of these numbers. All right, is there anybody that would like to raise their hand and quickly explain how did you solve this problem? I'm going to get a volunteer to explain how they solved this problem. All right, Dwight, can you explain how you solved this problem?
So I ordered the numbers from least to greatest. I knew the mode was the number that we see most often. The median is the number in the middle, and the mean is basically the average. So I just did a quick calculation.
Okay, how did you know what calculation to use to find the mean?
The average is the sum of the numbers divided by the total number of numbers. So it's something that I remember.
Right. Can you share what your answers for mean, median, and mode were?
So the mode is 5, the median is 6, and the mean is 6.8, but I was still working to get the decimal as far as I could.
Okay. And do you feel confident in your answer?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing. With that in mind, we're going to do one more problem. Create a data set with at least 7 values so that the mean is 20, the median is 12, and the mode is 23. So take a moment and solve that problem on your scratch piece of paper. All right. Has anybody gotten an answer to this or was willing to raise their hand and talk us through a little bit about how you did this? Anybody willing to share at least how they started this process? All right, we're going to hear from Adriana.
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
So I started by figuring out the total amount that we need, which is the mean 20 times 7.
Okay.
Or 140. Then I subtracted 12 and I subtracted some 23s until it was low enough. The result was low enough such that 12 could be the middle number and that we could have the same amount on the left as on the right. But I haven't finished completely, so I don't have my total list, but that's my plan.
Great. Does anybody else that's here with us today have an idea or approach this problem differently, or at least get started in a different way? Do you want to hear from Kurt? All right, I got another response from Kirk. He typed in saying that he used some trial and error, which is another way to solve this problem. It's interesting how the problem really changes between task 1 and task 2. There's different types of discourse that is supported by each task. When we look at task 1, where there is really one route to the answer, we see a very linear conversation. The first one is very procedural and moves us the second one, however, moves us just by nature of the question to really justifying. We really have to prove how we got there. The richness and depth in that second conversation is a lot more noticeable, as is the rigor of the problem. The second one also allows the teacher to understand where the gap exists and to push students who are successful to possibly even develop different data sets. There's multiple solutions in the second answer, so even if you do complete that, it's very possible that students in the same classroom will be able to engage in discourse around, well, I tried it this way or I got a different answer with the same mean, the same median, and the same mode. Both tasks allow students to demonstrate their understanding of these concepts, but the second one has a more deeper, more connected conceptual understanding associated with it. In the next section, we're going to look at how you can encourage students to listen to one another, to disagree, to question. Something that I've seen used in a number of classrooms is this idea of mathematical sentence starters. Effective communication is a skill that's got to be taught. Teaching students how to have productive and respectful conversation is essentially one of the most important math skills that they can learn. The standards of mathematical practice also reference discourse as a skill critical for our youngest learners and high school students alike. So to support students in developing the skills, you may consider providing students with sentence starters or accountable talk prompts. So on this slide here, I've got a number of things that some teachers I've seen post them, some teachers rephrase other students' responses to include some of these. You might even, in addition to the ones here, things like my solution shows blank, or my partner pointed out to me that blank. Our group sees it differently. Here's how we approach the problem. So having these sentence starters up in the classroom really enables students to have almost like a bank of options for how they might start their conversations. And really encouraging them to use these is helpful. And finally, we're going to look at a list of questions, and I've got a number of questions here that can help students clarify and justify their ideas. So I'm going to kind of zip through these a little bit just so you can see them. Again, the PowerPoint will be available to you online after this webinar. So the categories of questions that we might look at that really encourage discourse are listed here. I'm going to walk through a few examples of each of these on the following slides. Encouraging students to work together and make sense of mathematics provides us with a number of questions that really stress changing habits. As we move toward more student-student discourse, questions such as the ones on the screen right now remind students to talk to each other instead of talking to the teacher. Questions like number 8, can you convince the rest of us that your answer makes sense? Or number 9, what do others think about what blank said? Really moves you as a teacher out of the role of that mighty answer holder. It puts it back on the students. The scaffolding and essentially encouraging students to talk with each other and learn from each other requires more questions up front in order to change habits. And as students are used to hearing these types of questions, and they know that you as a teacher are not giving them the answers, they really rely on their peers, and eventually, and hopefully, that will become where they come first. On slide 22, we see how we empower students to rely on themselves to determine whether something is mathematically correct. And using these questions can really change the dynamic of your classroom. It removes you as a teacher from the role of the person that's going to tell them whether or not they're right. Something I did frequently as a classroom teacher, never giving students the answers. When a student comes to you and says, hey, did I get this answer right? Really just shrug your shoulders and say, I'm not sure. Do you think you got it right? And if you do, how do you know? It really changed the thinking of the students in my classroom from this feeling of needing validation to getting them to a place where they could say, I know I'm right and I can prove it. And so changing kind of that mentality of where they're going to learn or figure out if their answers are actually correct. Questions can also support student in learning to reason mathematically, as seen here in questions 26 through 34. There's also teaching students to evaluate their own processes and engage in productive peer interaction. And something to keep in mind, I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, as we look at all of these questions, they're presented here as verbal questions, but these can be differentiated. They might be journal prompts. They might be exit tickets that students can respond to. Discourse does not have to be spoken. It can be communicated in drawings or flowcharts, especially as we think of our special populations, such as English language learners. It might be easier for them not to communicate spoken, whereas they could maybe be able to better articulate their thoughts in pictures or drawings. Questions can also help students with problem comprehension. Often students struggle with tasks because they don't understand what is being asked of them. Questions like the ones on the screen right now help students decipher complex problems while building tools for when you, the teacher, are not around. One strategy to get better at these questions is to never answer a question a student asks that does not indicate the student has tried to understand the problem themselves. For instance, when a student says, hey, how do you do question number 6? Or I don't know how to do question number 20. That doesn't communicate that the student has even read the task, let alone attempted it. So building in questions where you're asking them to really make sense of the problem before you support them in solving the problem is a useful strategy. Questions can also help students learn to conjecture, invent, and solve problems. Help students to connect mathematics, its ideas, and its applications. This really enables them to see patterns and think about how they can translate what they're learning now to, or what they learned before to what they're learning now. And questions help students learn how to persevere. We've all had the student that needs these questions. Often when a student is struggling with a problem or task, their instinct is to shut down and to wait for the teacher to bail them out or to really tell them how to proceed. Questions like these really help to encourage the student to keep going by offering them just a little bit so that they can get unstuck and keep moving. If they have nowhere to go or have no idea where to start, that shutdown tends to kick in quicker. Questions like this get them to be able to continue progressing and by use scaffolding and supports. Questions can also help students focus on the mathematics from activities. So I'm going to leave some time before I go on to our next slide. There is another slide, but wanted to see if there's any questions from the group on this idea of mathematical discourse. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into your question box, or if you want to speak them, you can also raise your hand. All right. So I've got a question here that asks for mathematical question stems aligned to the standards of mathematical practice. I do not have anything like that handy, but I can look to see if I can find something and post that as a resource on our website when I post this webinar as well. I received another question that says, if you have a low performing student that's not at grade level, how do you help that student? And I think that the critical part is really planning your questions ahead of time and thinking about where is that student going to get stuck, and what are the questions that I can ask. So this webinar obviously had a number of questions to really get you as a teacher to think about what types of questions are available for your use. But with a student that's either under grade level or that's really struggling or that's in that shutdown mode or their alarm zone as far as their level of competence is being challenged, it's extremely critical as a teacher that you're really pushing them to build that confidence by asking them questions that move them just a little bit. And so instead of asking them the same question that you might ask students, you're trying to minimize their productive struggle, or I guess I shouldn't say their productive struggle, their extreme struggle, and continue to keep them, figure out the supports that they need, the questions that you can ask to keep them in that realm of productive struggle without getting to a place of panic or shutdown. On this slide, I've got an activity that you can try to take back to your classroom. This is something that I've seen some teachers do that's quite interesting. Consider inviting a colleague into your classroom to scribe students' conversations while you teach. So this is somebody that's coming into your classroom not really to pay attention to what you as a teacher are doing, but to look at the conversations that are happening in your classroom and to almost verbatim write down what the students are saying to each other and what is the level of conversation that's going on in your classroom at the tables around the room. Once you receive that transcript, essentially, of the conversations in your classroom, it's a very useful exercise to just pay attention to what types of conversations are happening in your classroom, especially when you're not around. What types of discourse are your students engaging in? Are they kind of hovering at this answering, sharing part? Or are they really focusing at some of those higher levels of challenging their peers, or making predictions, or generalizing what fits and drawing connections? And challenge yourself to really come up with strategies to elevate the quality and quantity of mathematical discourse in your classroom. So it's a very useful tip to invite somebody in and say, hey, will you just write down everything you hear students saying? So they're not really focused on your practice in that moment, but it gives you an opportunity to really reflect on what you don't necessarily hear, because what students are saying when you're standing there versus when you're not is can be quite fascinating and provide some great insight into your practice. So I offer that to you as something that you might try if you feel comfortable inviting somebody into your classroom. Wanted to share real quickly before we wrap up some upcoming professional development opportunities that we are offering here at OSSI. There are a number of ways for you to get involved with professional development. There's 3 links listed here. Additionally, anybody who has attended this webinar today, we will be adding your email address to our internal mailing list so that you can receive notifications of upcoming professional development sponsored by OSSI. On our website, and I will also include this when I send out the survey tomorrow, there is a mathematics needs assessment survey that we are conducting here at OSSI. Your completion of that survey will enter you into a drawing to win a classroom set of whiteboards if you are interested in that. We're really looking to get information from people who are close to the math classroom to get a sense of what types of PD do you need, what types of PD do you want, and how can we at OSSI better support your professional development needs as a math teacher. So look out for that link that will be coming to you with the survey for this webinar tomorrow. I wanted to thank you all for attending today. I hope you found the content engaging and informational. You will, as I mentioned, receive an electronic feedback survey tomorrow that must be completed and submitted in order to receive professional learning units for this session. I will stick around for a few minutes. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question box. I have a question that asks if I could provide a link for the slides. I will make sure that I include a link when I send out the survey tomorrow of where the slides will be housed on our website so that you can either see the slides or participate in the webinar again.